is my presentation of the respiratory system. So we'll start off with the function of the system. The main function is to transport and exchange gases. So oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse between the air in the alveoli and the blood, and they'll do that until equilibrium is reached. It will also control the increase and decrease of breathing rate in order to speed up or slow it down. So the first gas that it transports is oxygen, and this will take up 21% of the air. And it's transported into the blood vessels via the respiratory system, and then it goes to the working muscles. Then we've got carbon dioxide, which takes up 0.03% of the air. And it's the waste product, so the respiratory system works just to remove it. Then there's hemoglobin, which is a globular protein, and it's got high affinity for oxygen. So when the oxygen diffuses across the capillary wall into the bloodstream, it will bind with the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. And then oxyhemoglobin is just when the oxygen binds to the red blood cells, and it will continue to transport oxygen into the tissues. So then the airways to the lungs. When we breathe in air, it will move through several airways and passages before reaching the alveoli in the lungs. So first we've got the nasal cavity, which is the only external part of the system, and it contains cilia on the inside which work to filter the air, preventing dust particles from progressing down the airway. And the rest of the cavity is lined with mucous membranes which secrete antibacterial enzymes to destroy any dust that does get through. Then we've got the epiglottis, which is a flap of cartilage which sits at the top of the larynx, and it covers the esophagus when we're breathing, and when we're swallowing, it covers the trachea. That just means that food and air doesn't go down the wrong passageways, and it will prevent infection in the lungs. Then the pharynx is shaped like a funnel, and it connects the nasal cavity and the mouth to the larynx and the esophagus. Its wall is made of skeletal muscle, which makes it easier to push air through, and it also contains cilia, which will just stop any particles that have got through. Then the larynx, which is known as the voice box, and it's located between the pharynx and the trachea, and it's made of cartilage which prevents the airway from collapsing, meaning that our airway is open and our breathing is efficient, and it's also got a twitching mechanism to guide the air the right way. Then we've got the trachea, which descends from the larynx to the neck, and it ends by splitting into two main bronchi. It's flexible and mobile due to the C-shaped rings of cartilage that surround it, meaning that it can guide air into the lungs and prevent collapse. So that's just the structure, and the structure of the trachea is very similar in the bronchus and bronchioles as well. So then the bronchus this will split off from the trachea, and it functions to guide air into the lungs. So we've got the right one, which is wider, shorter and more vertical than the left. And that means that any foreign objects that come down the trachea are more likely to enter into the right side of the lung. Then the bronchioles branch off from the bronchi, and they lead air into the alveoli, which again contain C-shaped cartilage to maintain the airway and prevent collapse. The trachea, bronchioles and bronchi all contain smooth muscles within their wall which can contract and constrict, and that means that they can reduce airflow if we're breathing in hazardous substances. And then it'll also they contract to increase the airflow, so when we're exercising they can do that. So then moving on to the structure of the lungs occupy most of the thoracic cavity, and are the main component of the respiratory system, with the heart located slightly to the left, which is what causes the left lung to be slightly smaller. So the first is the lobes. We've got 2 on the left side and 3 on the right, and this is because the left has the cardiac notch, which makes room for the heart. Every lobe has got its own individual artery and vein, and it receives air from individual bronchus. The lobes are completely separate, which means that if one lobe collapses or it's got an infection, we only have to shut down one lobe rather than the whole lung. Then the pleural membrane surrounds each lung and ensures that no air can escape. It also separates the 2 lungs, which is beneficial if one collapses or it's infected. Then the pleural cavity is located in between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. It's thin and filled with pleural fluid, which prevents friction when the lungs are expanding. Then the parietal pleura is the outermost membrane, which covers the thoracic wall as well as the top of the diaphragm. It surrounds the heart and between both lungs, forming walls to separate the organs. It works to secrete and produce pleural fluid, which prevents friction when they're expanding. The thoracic cavity is protected by the thoracic wall, and it holds the vital organs, so the heart and the lungs, and blood vessels as well. It's large and hollow, which means that there's plenty of space for the contents, and when the lungs expand during inspiration, there's room for them to do so. The visceral pleura is the innermost of the two membranes, and it covers the surface of the lungs, and it also dips into spaces in between the lobes. It's covered with smooth mesothelial cells, which mean that the surface is slippery, enabling free movement when we breathe. The pleural fluid is produced by both of those membranes, and it fills the cavity that's between them. It's slippery, so it allows the lungs to move freely without friction, and the membranes move freely. However, there's surface tension in the pleural fluid, so they don't separate at all. And finally, we've got the alveoli, which are located at the end of bronchioles. They're just air sacs, and there's approximately 300 million per lung. They take up most of the volume in each lung, which means there's a large surface area for diffusion. The external surfaces are covered by capillaries for exchange into the blood, and they've got very thin walls, which means there's a short diffusion distance for the gas to travel. So then we've got lung volumes. So this is a spirometer trace, and it just shows the volumes and capacities when we're breathing. So the first is tidal volume. This is the volume of air that can be moved in and out of the lungs in one breath at a resting state, and for a healthy adult this is 0.5 decimeter squared cubed. Then the inspiratory and expiratory reserve volumes. So the inspiratory is bigger than the expiratory just because when we breathe out there has to be residual volume left in the lungs. The inspiratory is the additional volume of air that can be inhaled above tidal volume, and expiratory is additional volume that can be exhaled above tidal volume. Then the vital capacity is the largest volume of air that can be moved into and out of the lungs in one breath. So the average is 5 decimeter cubed. Then we've got residual volume, which relates to the air that's always left in the lungs. So that's after forced exhalation. This is important because it prevents the lungs from collapsing, and on average we've got about 1.5 decimeter cubed in our lungs at all times, which is equivalent to 1.5 litres. And then total lung capacity is the maximum amount of air present in the lungs at one time. So this will be after we breathe in but before we breathe out. So then when we control our breathing, there's two ways. It can be chemical or neural. So chemical involves the chemoreceptors within the medulla, aortic arch and the carotid arteries, and they detect changes in the concentration of carbon dioxide and oxygen within the blood, and it will increase or decrease breathing rate accordingly. So say during exercise we've got a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, so breathing rate will increase to remove that. And then neural, we can have voluntary or involuntary. So voluntary control occurs in the cerebral cortex of the brain, whilst the involuntary is in the medulla, and it's responsible for the rhythm generation. Within neural control, the changes in breathing are detected by receptors in the lungs, and the brain then sends nerve impulses to the respiratory muscles, where the frequency of breathing is controlled. So then the muscles that are involved in the breathing mechanism, we've got the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. So for the diaphragm, this is a dome-shaped piece of muscle and tendon that separates the thorax and the abdomen. When we breathe in, the muscle contracts to flatten out, and it increases the volume of the chest cavity, and that just draws air into the lungs. And then when the diaphragm relaxes, it recoils into a dome shape, forcing air out of the lungs by decreasing the volume of the chest cavity. So there's two intercostal muscles. We've got internal and external. So they are just groups of muscles that sit between each rib, and they form and move the chest wall, but they're mainly involved in the mechanical movement. So internal intercostal muscles draw the ribs downwards and inwards during exhalation, and that will decrease the volume of the chest cavity. And the external intercostal muscles do the opposite, so they pull the ribs up and out, increasing the volume of the chest cavity. So in the breathing mechanism, it will differ depending on whether we're taking in or expelling air, and the process will be faster or slower depending on whether we're exercising. So for inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and moves downwards. The external intercostal muscles contract, pulling the ribcage up and out, which then increases the volume of the thorax, and that means the air pressure in the thorax decreases. Overall, the volume increases by 500 mils. Air pressure in the lungs decreases, so more air flows in, and since the diaphragm has moved down, the pressure in the abdominal cavity is increased. Pleural cavity pressure then becomes lower. So as air moves in, it means that the lungs have a higher pressure than the outside, so they expand and that will draw air in. And then if we move on to expiration, the diaphragm releases, moving upwards, and the external intercostal muscles fall, relax, so the ribs fall. The ribs and sternum will put pressure on the lungs, and air moves out of the lungs, and the pressure in the thoracic cavity increases because it's being made smaller. So it expands, squeezing the lungs and forcing air out. So during exercise for inspiration, the thoracic volume will increase, and it will get assistance from the pectorals and trapezius muscles to help raise the rib cage. So that will extend it beyond 500 mils. And then during exercise for expiration, the internal intercostal muscles and abdominals contract together to pull the rib cage down. And then finally we've got gaseous exchange. So after we breathe in, there's a high concentration of oxygen in the lungs and a low concentration within the blood. The capillaries run very closely to the alveoli in the lungs, so there's a short diffusion distance. Due to the rules of diffusion, the oxygen will diffuse out of the alveoli through the wall of the capillary and into the blood where the concentration is lower. And it attaches to the hemoglobin, so then we get oxyhemoglobin. There's a high concentration of CO2 in the blood at this point, so that needs to be removed. So again, it will transfer from the blood into the alveoli, and then we breathe that out. So the wall of the alveoli and the capillary are both one cell thick, which means that gaseous exchange is much more efficient. The capillaries are narrow, which means the blood cells are squeezed against the wall, which again will reduce diffusion distance. And they're also travelling at a slower rate, which means that the red blood cells have got time to attach to the maximum amount of oxygen, which will maintain the concentration gradient.